In this video you will learn that the Bible actually assumes reincarnation and even teaches it. You will see the 7 Bible passages that I would like to introduce to you in this video. I have written down which scene it is about. Many Bible readers will know these passages without having to look them up. If you want, you can stop the video now and consider for yourself whether it is plausible to you that a theologically sound doctrine of reincarnation can be justified in these well-known Bible passages. The video will continue in a few moments. I am of the opinion that in the early days of early Christianity, after Jesus' resurrection and ascension, reincarnation was taught by the apostles in the way I am suggesting here. Unfortunately, this knowledge of reincarnation was lost over time. Let yourself be surprised if I can convince you of my ideas. To begin with, I will tell you 3 principles that are very important in the theology of reincarnation. In the Great Commission, Jesus also concealed the fact that, in addition to us humans, there are also non-humans on earth who also need to be saved from hell or extinction. These are the Nephilim mentioned in the 6th chapter of Genesis, but in my opinion also other beings who lived in prehistoric times. Therefore, there will be no changes in theology for people. Reincarnation only concerns beings from ancient times who must be born again and again in human or animal bodies until a point in time determined by Jesus. People only live once and then face their final judgment in the afterlife without being reborn on earth as a human or animal. Only non-humans reincarnate continuously, until the time set by Jesus. The purpose of reincarnation is not to redeem oneself by reaching a state of consciousness. Non-human beings from prehistoric times must constantly reincarnate as humans or animals as retribution for what these beings did to humans in prehistoric times, i.e., the time before the flood. There they gave people deadly puzzle challenges. At that time, a person was chosen to solve the task or tasks. If this person failed and could not solve the tasks given to him, many people in his family, his city or his entire region were killed or eaten by the Nephilim, or the people of entire cities were taken out of their human bodies by the gods who still ruled the earth at that time, who are mentioned by the Holy Spirit in Psalm 82 in the Bible, and immediately integrated into animal bodies. From that moment on, the people affected no longer knew that they had once been human. They forgot their entire previous life up to that point in one fell swoop. Let us assume hypothetically that this could actually have been the case. How do you think Jesus would react if such conditions really had existed on earth in ancient times? Is it not logical and theologically explainable that he would simply wipe such a civilization off the face of the earth through a major cataclysmic event and pay back the gods from Psalm 82 or the Nephilim and the other tyrannical beings of ancient times in the same coin and then, at a certain point, let them incarnate in bodies of other species, with complete loss of memory of their own true identity? But let us now turn to the Bible passages which, in my opinion, provide conclusive evidence that the idea of reincarnation was present in early Christianity and that reincarnation must also have been taught by the apostles in some way. Many of us know the scribe Nicodemus from the Bible, who came to Jesus one night and asked him whether it was possible for a person to be born again from his mother. When I was looking into the issue of reincarnation in 2022 or 2023, ChatGPT pointed out to me that the Bible translators seem to be mistranslating something here. Here in John 3 verse 4 they turned an indefinite possessive pronoun into a definite one, which leads to a significant distortion of the meaning. Possessive pronouns are so-called possessive words, like my, as, your, like, to be, etc. If these are very precise, i.e., specific, then this is related to a very specific person. So, my house, or your house, or his car. In contrast, there are indefinite possessive words where everything is less precise. It is not possible to assign them to a specific person. So not my house, but a house. So not your bike, but a bike. So not your car, but a car. And thus at the end in John 3 verse 4 not his mother, but a mother. There is a significant difference in the meaning of a sentence when Nicodemus asks Jesus the question, "How can a man be born when he is old?" Can he enter the second time into his mother's womb and be born? Or the question, how can a man be born when he is old? Can he enter the second time into a mother's womb and be born? Most likely, however, the indefinite possessive pronoun is in the original Greek text, and we must read, how can a man be born when he is old? Can he enter the second time into a mother's womb and be born? We can see the stark difference in meaning ourselves. If the original Greek text does not actually contain a definite but rather an indefinite possessive pronoun, then Nicodemus is having a conversation with Jesus about the possibility of human reincarnation. This is of unimagined theological significance. This must also have been clear to the Bible translators, which is why they deliberately made a wrong translation for us and turned an indefinite possessive pronoun in German, English, or Russian into a definite possessive pronoun. This distorts the meaning of the Greek, and otherwise Nicodemus' question to Jesus makes no sense at all, because it is not our practice to expect adults to return to their mother's womb. The whole verse, the whole context, only really makes sense if there is an indefinite possessive pronoun in the Greek and Jesus is talking to Nicodemus about the possibility or impossibility of reincarnation. In our current Bible, important passages of the conversation between Nicodemus and Jesus must have been omitted during the course of church history, so that it appears that this is an abstract theological conversation about the rebirth of a Christian in baptism, which is essentially invisible to us. It is of great significance that Jesus does not reject the idea of reincarnation. It would be a very good opportunity for him to deny the possibility of reincarnation in general, but he does not do so. Of further dogmatic significance is the fact that the idea of reincarnation must have existed in Judaism during Jesus' lifetime, which means that the early Christians in early Christianity must also have assumed the possibility of reincarnation. This is of dogmatic importance because the Roman Pope is called to preserve the teachings of Jesus. If this teaching has been distorted or forgotten in the course of church history, the Roman Pope can reintroduce it into the universal church without being a heretic. The fact that, according to current Catholic theology, such a case constellation is completely unthinkable, that the Roman bishops would allow traditional beliefs to be forgotten, is not addressed in this video, but in another video on this channel, which will deal with the dogma of papal infallibility. We will now assume, for the sake of argument, that the Roman papacy and the other Christian churches in the world have also lost revealed faith, for whatever reason. It is then the task of the popes and other Christian church leaders of today to reintegrate this lost faith into the teaching office and to proclaim the gospel of Christ to Christians in the correct, original, old way, just as Jesus did with his 12 apostles. In this case, the current pope, who is called Francis at the time the video was made, must prove that reincarnation was definitely in the minds of Jews and Christians during his lifetime and that Jesus did not reject reincarnation as a heresy. I think I can prove this conclusively with the Bible passages presented in this video alone. In doing so, I have provided an important dogmatic prerequisite for reincarnation to be included in Christian theology again in the foreseeable future. With the correct translation of the indefinite possessive pronoun in John 3 verse 4, this is also possible for the Christian Theological Guild. Should Pope Francis or one of his successors reintroduce the reincarnation of non-humans into the universal church, this would not be an impermissible innovation and therefore a heresy, but in my opinion only the restoration of the original teaching of Jesus to Peter and the other 11 apostles. As I said, the idea that a Roman Pope could lose revealed faith is not something that can be imagined in today's Catholic theology. However, Protestants, Anglicans and Orthodox Christians will have no problems with this. As I said, I will address this specific problem in the Catholic Church in another video on this channel. If this is the case, then the Apostle Paul must also have taught reincarnation after he was made an apostle by Jesus as a late caller and bypassed the other apostles. So we can read in James 3 verse 6, "And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity, so is the tongue among our members, that it defileth the whole body, and setteth on fire the course of nature, and it is set on fire of hell." According to information from ChatGPT, the often used German phrase, course of existence, or course of life, can also be translated as wheel of birth, which is a clear indication of the idea of reincarnation. Who can tell us and prove that the translation, wheel of birth, was not used in this way in the early church? I assume that only the rejection of the idea of reincarnation in modern Christian theology to date excludes this essentially permissible translation variant. It is easier to write course of existence into our modern translations. Otherwise, Christian dogma would have to be corrected again, which would generally be too great a hurdle for theologians, not just for Catholic theologians, for whom this would be out of the question, but Orthodox, Protestant and Anglican theologians are also certainly not happy to learn that even dogmas have not been correctly preserved throughout the history of the Church. In my opinion, Jesus even confirms the then common view of reincarnation in a conversation with his disciples. I cannot say to what extent a distinction was already made between humans and non-humans at that time. With the conversation with Nicodemus, we have the problem that, after eliminating the incorrect translation, we now know that Nicodemus spoke to Jesus about the topic of reincarnation. Specifically, Nicodemus asked whether reincarnation exists. When healing a man born blind, Jesus directly confirms that reincarnation must exist. One day Jesus and his disciples passed by a man who had been born blind. We must know that it must have been common practice at the time to view strokes of fate as the direct work of God. So if someone is seriously ill, it must have been God's punishment for some sin. The problem here was that this man was born blind. Therefore, only his parents could be considered, for whom God struck him with blindness and punished him, or a previous life of the man who was born blind. The disciples also asked Jesus whether the man's sin was to blame for his blindness. But that only works if you believe that reincarnation exists. Jesus says that it is not due to the sin of the parents or the husband. The indication that it is not due to the sin of the husband can legitimately be interpreted as Jesus actually confirming the common view of reincarnation at the time. Otherwise, he could have clearly rejected and criticized this idea, along the lines of there is never any form of reincarnation. He does not do that and even formulates his words in such a way that one can actually recognize the legitimacy of the idea of reincarnation. In the opposite case, one could also interpret the statement that the man did not sin as a rejection of the idea of reincarnation. It is a double-edged statement that allows for both schools of thought. In modern times, the Christian churches have done the thinking for us and rejected the idea of reincarnation. Today, theology no longer even discusses how the Bible passage about the healing of the man born blind could be interpreted differently. In the passages about Nicodemus and the man born blind, we must conclude that Jesus did not reject the then prevailing view of the possibility of reincarnation. However, there is a direct passage in the Bible where he actually openly and directly confirms the existence of reincarnation. At least that is how it can be interpreted. This passage is in the incident on Mount Transfiguration, which many of my viewers will certainly already know from the Bible. Jesus once took Peter, James, and John up a mountain and was transfigured there. During the transfiguration, the three disciples could see Jesus talking with Moses and Elijah. On the way back, Jesus forbade them to talk about this transfiguration with the others. If you don't know from the outset that reincarnation was part of the Jewish way of thinking at the time of Jesus, you won't really be able to understand the scene on Mount Transfiguration, because that's where Elijah was seen. The disciples knew that the prophet Malachi had prophesied that Elijah would have to appear before the Messiah. That is written in Malachi 3 verse 23 in the Old Testament. The disciples spoke to Jesus about prophecies about Jesus himself in the Old Testament. They also spoke about Elijah, whom they had just seen. In this dialogue with his disciples, Jesus confirms that John the Baptist is actually the Old Testament prophet Elijah. Jesus does not mean that John the Baptist has a ministry like Elijah, but that there is personal identity between the two. In my opinion, this is also clearly expressed in the announcement of the birth of John the Baptist. When the angel says that John the Baptist will act in the spirit and power of Elijah, what is meant is that Elijah is also a person. In the biblical context, a spirit is always understood as personal. This should not be confused with our modern way of thinking when we think that we are spiritually aligned with someone or somehow soul mates. We might say today, I am called to be an evangelist like Billy Graham. This is how we read and interpret Luke 1 verse 17 with our modern way of thinking. And that is the mistake. This modern way of thinking filters out the actual message that the angel said to the priest Zechariah when he announced to him the birth of John the Baptist. Luke 1 verse 17 should not be confused with modern expressions such as, in the spirit of democracy, or, in the spirit of National Socialism. Such a vague weakness of meaning is unknown in the Bible. Spirits are always to be understood personally. If someone acts in the spirit of someone, then he is that spirit. Then he is that person. When doing exegesis, we must always bear in mind that our current way of thinking and our current understanding of the culture and knowledge of past eras is only incomplete. Our horizon of thought today is not the same as it was in prehistoric times or during the time when Jesus lived as a human being on earth. When doing exegesis of the Bible, we must always take into account how people spoke and thought back then. As already explained, we must not read the Bible through our modern glasses. If we do, we will very often come to wrong conclusions, and important pillars of theology and dogmatics can also develop incorrectly. The fact that the Jews absolutely believed in reincarnation during their lifetime is also made clear by another Bible passage. This passage from the Bible is also very well known to most Christians. One day Jesus asked his disciples who people thought he was. It is interesting that the contemporaries of Jesus and Peter firmly believed that Jesus was someone who had lived on earth in the past. It doesn't matter whether it was Elijah or one of the other Old Testament prophets. It must also have been generally known to some extent that John the Baptist was Elijah. That would not surprise me, because one can assume that John the Baptist's father later told the others about the incident with the angel, and thus the words that we know from Luke 1 would also have been known to the wider public. The only difference would have been whether people believed it or not. But that's how it is today too. There are no differences from the time 2,000 years ago. On Mount Transfiguration, we can see that not all Jews of that time believed that John the Baptist was the reincarnation of the deceased Old Testament prophet Elijah. On the way back from Mount Transfiguration, Jesus himself said to his disciples that many did not recognize John the Baptist as Elijah. It is interesting that at that time it must have been known that simultaneous physical reincarnations could also occur. A being can not only incarnate in one body, but also in more than one body. We can see this from the fact that people also thought Jesus was John the Baptist, who lived parallel to Jesus. How could it be that the Jews at that time thought that two different people who lived on earth at the same time were one and the same reincarnated person? This can only be explained if one knows the concept of reincarnation and also knows that in this concept some beings can appear in different physical manifestations at the same time. I have heard something similar from Buddhism, for example, which does indeed make similar statements in its writings. Even though I refer to Buddhism here and pick out one point and consider it to be correct, I would like to state that I am not a supporter of the idea of a unified world religion. At the beginning of the video I already said that I understand the concept of reincarnation in the sense that one does not redeem oneself by reaching a higher state of consciousness, but rather that Jesus repays the non-humans of ancient times in kind for their own crimes against humans. We know this principle from the Bible, where Jesus says that exactly what we do to other people will happen to us. So if we do good to them, good will happen to us. If we do bad to them and eat people or separate their souls from their human bodies and anchor these detached human souls in animal bodies where they do not belong, then we must expect that the triune biblical God, consisting of God the Father, God the Son and God the Holy Spirit, will pay back those responsible in kind, and that the guilty will suffer the same fate in the court of law. If necessary, it could also be a combination punishment, meaning that non-human beings from ancient times have to reincarnate in animal bodies and then be eaten by humans. If in ancient times everything was done in connection with solving riddles, Jesus will also ensure that in his judgment the guilty can only be saved from their punishment by solving riddles. He will therefore not announce anything like this openly and offensively in the Bible. At best, we can be happy that we can indirectly derive relevant information from loose snippets of information in the Bible. Then we might read in the Bible that at the end of the Genesis process there were no carnivores, and suddenly, out of the blue, Jesus allowed humans to eat meat without the Holy Spirit explaining in more detail in his Bible how he came to this change of heart. And this is even more so when theologians assume that the moral values of the biblical God cannot change, because this would contradict the essence and nature of Jesus, and moral values must therefore be unchangeable and eternally valid. I doubt that today's theologians have even begun to recognize the depth and significance of the permission for humans to eat meat in Genesis 9 verse 3. And I can and will destroy important pillars of our present-day theology and dogma with Genesis 9 verse 3. So far we have only seen Bible passages from the New Testament, but I have also found a passage in the Old Testament. This can be found in the book of Job 28, verses 28 to 30. There the psalmist prophetically reports that someone was repeatedly brought out of the pit by God into the light. In my opinion, the pit is the place where the dead are. So when the biblical God repeatedly brings a person out of the pit, I can interpret this to mean that he died several times and was then reborn into the earth. Today's theology would interpret these verses only metaphorically or figuratively. We would be told that the pit is only symbolic and is meant to represent that someone has sinned gravely and has been rescued from this sinful swamp by Jesus. It is simply like stubbornly refusing to call a half-full glass of water half-empty and insisting on the term half-full because one simply cannot stand the other word. However, theology should always take all aspects into account and give precise reasons why a translation or interpretation that is otherwise permissible should not be made. In the case of this Bible passage, it is clear. Modern Christian theology has forgotten the knowledge of the early apostles regarding reincarnation. Knowledge that was once known and that the apostles taught the early Christians has been lost over time. I assume that most non-humans have no idea about their previous lives as humans or animals. This means that they also do not know which order of creation and which species they belong to in ancient times, i.e., who they really are. In principle, these non-humans are dead or, to be more specific, undead beings in their human bodies today. Only non-humans who have made great progress in their sanctification process know who they really are. They will also have the knowledge of their numerous previous lives with them. These non-humans can choose which family they are born into. This does not always have to be pleasant for them. For reasons of sanctification and repentance for themselves or others, one can decide to be born into a family where one is abused and harmed, or where one is not well off in some other way. The non-human soul concerned will decide what will be best with Jesus before birth in the afterlife and, if necessary, will also make arrangements with other non-human souls who will then meet in life on earth. These are then the so-called soul contracts or reincarnation contracts. If Jesus believes that living a life of poverty and homelessness is best for sanctification, then one could choose, for example, to be born in the United States and then exist as a homeless person in New York City or Los Angeles. But you can also decide to be born into a family where you take on political responsibility. Up until the 19th century, these were the classic royal families or the high nobility. Today, there are no longer any ruling royal families in the West, but the nominally democratic West is de facto led by a few ruling families that we in the West all know only too well, and to whom our Western governments, including our German federal and state governments, are subservient, regardless of how the respective national law relates to the political goals of our ruling families. We all know these ruling families. It is the Forbes, the Clintons, the Obamas, the Fords, the Rockefellers, the Bushes, or, for that matter, the House of von der Leyen, to name another European oligarchic ruling family. If a non-human wants to have political influence in his next life on Earth, he can deliberately be born into these ruling families and then implement his agenda, which probably has something to do with the challenge that Jesus gave to a group of reincarnated non-human beings. I would not be surprised if in post-flood history a significant number of political rulers were actually reincarnated non-humans who all knew who they once were. This raises the question of why, despite this, there has essentially only been murder and manslaughter in politics since the end of the flood up to and including today. and why in recent decades this has even degenerated into systematic crimes against humanity and genocide, for example in the area of healthcare. For if I were a reincarnated non-human in political responsibility today, I would already know about Jesus and his deadly divine justice, and that I was already taken away by him at the time of the flood because of my crimes and sins. Then, in every reincarnated life, whether as an animal or a human, I would try to avoid doing what displeases Jesus, and that is sin. That is why it was a great surprise for me to be suspected that many members of our current ruling families in the West are reincarnated non-humans who, moreover, even have an adaptive memory, i.e., they have the knowledge of their previous lives and can apply it, something that is not possible for most reincarnated non-humans on Earth. One solution would be for Jesus, as mirrored justice, to force non-humans in the modern age to carry out deadly challenges. So if a prehistoric party here in the modern age manages to kill 1 billion people, for example, 1 billion members of this order of creation and species will not end up in hell or extinction. Alternatively, you can also have the challenge of preventing births. For every birth prevented, whether through abortion or more superficial measures by preventing pregnancies through mechanical contraceptives, one non-human soul will not end up in hell or extinction. I, for one, could very well imagine that Jesus would act in this way towards the non-humans from the ancient world. What do you think as my viewers? This could be a possible explanation as to why our oligarchic ruling families in the West pursue such anti-family policies and generally want to implement a reduction in the world population through measures in the healthcare system and in the food industry, by using pathogenic substances in our food to cause a shallow and silent but constant genocide here in the West but also elsewhere in the non-West on Earth. In this case, it would be a mirrored justice, because in ancient times, people had to compete against each other through their riddle solvers. They were the representatives of a larger group of people. If a riddle solver solved a riddle for his city or region, nothing bad happened. The other human cities or regions that could not solve their riddles through their riddle solvers were then killed, eaten by the Nephilim, had to live as animals, or were permanently tortured in a prison in certain places for the rest of their lives. I suspect that of the approximately 8 billion people today, only a minority are real people, i.e., people who belong to the species Homo sapiens. To give you a figure, perhaps even less than 1 billion. The vast majority are non-humans reincarnated in human bodies, most of whom do not know who they are. However, I cannot logically justify this intuitive assumption, let alone provide any sources. Jesus ended the era of the flood and the confusion of languages that was so terrible for Homo sapiens and reversed the situation. Now the former tormentors of the past must also complete survival challenges, whereby the conditions of the past also apply today. Back in prehistoric times, the riddle solvers received hardly any clues, and also false clues. For example, they were told that a useful clue could be found in the forest on the left. In fact, it was in the forest on the right. We need to keep these presumed conditions in mind in order to hear the cries for help that are hidden from us from ancient creatures threatened with extinction. In some cases, this may help us better understand current political events. In practice, this could look like this.
Ich bin Niklas, 17 Jahre alt und verbrenne hier heute mein 1,0 Abi-Zeugnis. Mit diesem Zeugnis könnte ich studieren, was und wo ich will. Dieses Zeugnis steht für Karrierechancen. Für Chancen, die ich nicht nutzen werde.
Wie sollen wir was aus uns machen, wenn wir schon keine Zukunft haben? All die Mühe der Welt bringt uns nichts in unserer Zukunftswelt. Deswegen verbrenne ich heute die Originalkopie von meinem Abschlusszeugnis. Weil ohne Aussicht auf eine sichere Zukunft sind die Noten, die wir schreiben, wertlos.
In plain language, it means that the first wave of prehistoric beings will no longer be able to reincarnate from the year 2030. This will not apply to all non-humans. However, a not insignificant number will be wiped out forever in the coming first wave or will go to hell if a saving riddle is not solved by humans in time today. The first step in solving the puzzle is to identify the puzzle itself. In the case of the members of the so-called last generation, it is the fact that they are facing their eternal fate. As of 2024, they will be extinct or go to eternal hell. The next step is to find out what should actually be done to save them. The riddles of ancient times were like this and of this kind. What is interesting about the last generation is that the time for Jesus' deferred grace period for some ancient beings will expire in the coming years or in our present time. Originally, I thought that there would be time until the second coming of Jesus. It was only when I saw Nicholas' video that I realized that for the first large group of prehistoric murderers, everything would be over by 2030. I know that for most viewers of my video, some of the statements must seem far-fetched and completely unbelievable. Nevertheless, I invite you to think about my statements again after some time. Perhaps at a later date you will view my statements in this video with a little less negative attitude. I would be interested to know what you think of my Bible passages on reincarnation. Does the Bible really teach reincarnation, or have I just selectively inserted my own interpretation of it? And if the Holy Spirit really teaches reincarnation in the Bible, why has it disappeared from the teachings of the Christian churches over time? Does it make sense that prehistoric beings who once lived on planets in our solar system and were wiped out by Jesus at the time of the earthly flood are now reincarnating as animals or people on Earth, and in many cases end up in our cooking pots and freezers if they have to be reincarnated as farm animals such as pigs, cattle, chickens, geese, etc.? Would you trust Jesus to arrange things on Earth like that for a certain period of time? If that is the case, is eating meat still morally acceptable for us, or should we gradually reduce our meat consumption? What do you think about that? Should the Pope and other Christian church leaders declare meat consumption to be morally unacceptable? What do you and your friends, work colleagues, and family members think about this question?